The year was 1939. The world was still haunted by the ghosts of the Great War, but the seeds of a much larger catastrophe had already been sown. From the ashes of economic collapse and the bitterness of the Treaty of Versailles, a dark ideology rose in Germany. Led by Adolf Hitler, the Nazi Party promised a return to glory through conquest. On September 1st, at 4:45 a.m., German forces crossed the Polish border. In an instant, the fragile peace of Europe shattered. Britain and France, realizing that appeasement had failed, declared war. The stage was set for the most destructive conflict in human history. The German military introduced a new, terrifying form of warfare, blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Using highly mobile tanks and overwhelming air support, they bypassed traditional defenses. By the spring of 1940, the phony war ended as the Wehrmacht swept through Denmark, Norway, and the Low Countries. The world watched in shock as France, considered to have the finest army in Europe, collapsed in just 6 weeks. Thousands of Allied soldiers were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, saved only by a desperate civilian flotilla. With France fallen, Winston Churchill stood alone, rallying the British people with his iron will against the relentless bombing of the Luftwaffe. In June 1941, Hitler made his most fateful decision. He broke the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and launched Operation Barbarossa. 3 million soldiers marched east into the vast Russian plains. For a while, victory seemed certain, but the Russian winter and the sheer resilience of the Red Army slowed the Nazi machine. Meanwhile, across the world, the Empire of Japan sought to dominate Asia. On December 7, 1941, they launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt declared it a date which will live in infamy. The United States, the world's industrial powerhouse, was now fully committed to the war. The year 1942 was the pivot point. In the freezing ruins of Stalingrad, a brutal battle of attrition took place. The German Sixth Army was eventually surrounded and forced to surrender, marking the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. In the Pacific, the Battle of Midway crippled the Japanese Navy. In North Africa, the British victory at El Alamein pushed the Axis back. By 1944, the Allies were ready for the final blow. On June 6, known as D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history began on the beaches of Normandy. From that moment on, it was a race to Berlin from both the east and the west. As 1945 began, the horror of the Holocaust was revealed to the world as Allied troops liberated concentration camps. In April, as Soviet tanks rolled into Berlin, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8. However, the war in the Pacific raged on. To avoid a bloody invasion of the Japanese mainland, the United States deployed a terrifying new weapon. Atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Japan surrendered shortly after. The war was over, but the world was forever changed. Over 60 million people were dead, empires had crumbled, and the era of the Cold War and nuclear tension had begun. Beyond the battlefield, the Second World War witnessed the darkest chapter of human history, the Holocaust. Behind the front lines, the Nazi regime orchestrated a systematic industrial-scale genocide. From the ghettos of Warsaw to the gas chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau, 6 million Jews, along with Romani people, dissidents, and the disabled, were murdered. This was not just a byproduct of war. It was a state-sponsored machinery of death. When Allied soldiers finally breached the gates of these camps in 1945, the world saw the true face of the ideology they were fighting. The liberation of the camps remains one of the most haunting and sobering moments in modern history. While Europe bled, the Pacific was a different kind of hell. The war here was fought across vast oceans and tiny volcanic islands. The Japanese soldiers followed the code of Bushido, believing that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. This led to savage fighting in places like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan. Banzai charges and kamikaze pilots became symbols of Japanese desperation. The Americans, led by Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur, employed a strategy called island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified positions to seize airfields closer to the Japanese mainland. Each island captured was a stepping stone, paid for with the lives of thousands of Marines. The war was not won solely by soldiers. It was won in the factories. In the United States, millions of women, famously symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, entered the workforce to build the planes, tanks, and ships that would overwhelm the Axis. In the Soviet Union, entire factories were dismantled and moved eastward behind the Ural Mountains to escape the German advance. Meanwhile, civilians in cities like London, Berlin, and Tokyo endured constant aerial bombardment. Rationing became a way of life, and every scrap of metal was recycled for the war effort. This was total war, where the distinction between the soldier and the civilian blurred, and every citizen was a cog in the massive machine of national survival. In the aftermath of the surrender, the world sought justice. The Nuremberg trials marked the first time in history that a nation's leaders were held legally responsible for crimes against humanity. It established the principle that just following orders was no excuse for atrocities. As the smoke cleared, the geopolitical landscape had shifted. The old colonial empires of Britain and France began to crumble, leading to waves of decolonization. Two new superpowers, the USA and the USSR, emerged, standing face-to-face across a divided Europe. The Marshall Plan helped rebuild the shattered nations of the West, while the Iron Curtain fell across the East, setting the stage for a Cold War that would last for nearly half a century. As the celebratory echoes of victory in Europe Day faded, a chilling reality set in. The alliance between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union, born of necessity to defeat Hitler, began to crumble. In 1946, Winston Churchill delivered a famous speech in America, declaring that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. Europe was now split in two. In the East, Stalin established satellite states, ensuring a buffer zone for the USSR. In the West, the fear of communist expansion led to the creation of NATO in 1949. Germany itself became the front line of this new struggle, divided into West Germany and East Germany, with the city of Berlin trapped deep within the Soviet zone, soon to be a symbol of a world divided. The physical destruction of the war was unprecedented. Cities like Warsaw, Berlin, and Tokyo were literal piles of rubble. To prevent another economic collapse that could lead to radicalism, the United States launched the Marshall Plan. It funneled billions of dollars into rebuilding Europe's infrastructure and industries. This economic miracle transformed former enemies like West Germany and Japan into global industrial powerhouses within a decade. Meanwhile, the world's financial system was redesigned at the Bretton Woods Conference, establishing the IMF and the World Bank. The goal was simple: to create a global economy so interconnected that another world war would be financially impossible. World War II dealt a death blow to old-fashioned imperialism. Nations like Britain, France, and the Netherlands had been exhausted by the conflict. Having fought a war for freedom and self-determination, they found it increasingly difficult to justify holding onto colonies in Asia and Africa. In 1947, India gained independence, followed by a massive wave of decolonization across the globe. New nations emerged from the shadows of empire, often facing their own internal struggles as they navigated the complexities of the Cold War. The map of the world was being redrawn not by conquerors, but by people reclaiming their sovereignty. As we look back at the 6 years of total war, we see a story of unimaginable cruelty, but also of incredible courage. From the ordinary soldiers on the beaches of Normandy to the resistance fighters in the forests of Poland, millions stood up against tyranny. The cost was 60 million lives, a number so large it is difficult to comprehend. Today, the world still lives in the shadow of this conflict. We see it in our international laws, our borders, and our nuclear anxieties. The ultimate lesson of World War II remains clear. Peace is not merely the absence of war, but a fragile garden that must be tended every day with diplomacy, empathy, and a memory that refuses to forget the horrors of the past. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more fire.